Behold! The sword of power. Excalibur.
Welcome to the Oh Gosh, Oh Golly, Oh Wow podcast, the podcast where we talk about the Marvel comic series Excalibur and nothing but Excalibur every week for 126 plus weeks. This week in episode 24, discussing Excalibur number 23, Here Comes the Judge, we've smashed through the window of Illyana, Rasputin, and Kit Pryde's penthouse to arrive at the penultimate issue of the Cross-Time Caper. And guess what? Alan Davis is here doing stellar work as always on a densely packed Judge Dredd inspired issue. Excalibur number 23 was originally published in June 1990, and the creative team is Chris Claremont on writing, Alan Davis on pencils, Glynis Oliver on colors, Tom Orzechowski and Kevin Cunningham on letters, and Terry Kavanagh on editing.
Your wisdom has forged this ring. Hereafter, so that we remember our bonds, we shall always come together in a circle to hear and tell of deeds good and brave. I will build a round table where this fellowship shall meet. And a hall about the table. And a castle about the hall. And I will marry. And the land will have an heir to wield Excalibur. Knights of the Round Table.
We are not dreading chatting about this week's issue with a perfectly placed guest who I will introduce in a moment. But first, your regular enforcers. I am Dr. Anna Papard. I do lots of things, too many things sometimes, and most of those things involve talking about sex, gender, and representation in academic and popular places like Comics XF and the Middle Spaces, and a podcast I co-host with Andrew of this podcast called Three Panel Contrast. I remain, as always, Kurt Wagner's unofficial PR manager, and I am excited to defend him today, in which he pauses to kiss alternate universe Megan while escaping from the police, which results in her getting killed. But you know, he looks good doing it, and we'll talk about it. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll talk about it. Mav, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Christopher Maverick. I am a PhD student. I'm an adjunct instructor at Duquesne University and Mount Aloysius College. I am the host of another podcast as well called Box Popcast, where we discuss lots of different pop culture issues, including comics and movies and TV and pro wrestling and recently alcohol. And I also talk a lot about things like sex and gender and race and class in comics as well. And I am Le. And it's my Judge Dredd impression because I don't care what anybody says. That version of the movie is awesome.
Well, I'm sure our guest has opinions. Andrew, take it away.
I'm Dr. Andrew DeMann. I'm a lecturer at St. Jerome's University. I'm the project lead for the Claremont run. And we didn't talk about this in advance, but Magic is my favorite character ever.
Me too.
So Anna's love and apparently Mav's love and my love are intersecting a little bit in this issue. So that'll be a fun thing to talk about.
Not enough, but yes.
I'm looking forward to hearing your opinions on her, Andrew. I set up a question for you. We'll talk about it for sure.
Excellent.
So we are joined, as I mentioned, by a wonderful guest who knows a lot about the world of Judge Dredd in Scott Weatherly. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. Well, firstly, it's always great to talk comics, but, also great to talk Dredd to anybody.
We will give you plenty of opportunity to do that.
Yes,
I'll tell
I
the
have many questions, so I'm
Okay.
excited about this.
Awesome. Yeah, let's tell the listeners a little bit about Scott. So Scott is in his own words, not our words, a regular old project manager who started exploring 20th century pop culture, leading to the podcasts 20th Century Geek and Stories Out of Time and Space. Working on these has introduced him to some fantastic people and opportunities, including the chance to edit a book called Judging Dredd with Sequart, which I checked out this past week, and it's really excellent. We will definitely be linking that on our Twitter and in the show notes. So, Scott, I know your recent book about Judge Dredd, and I would love to learn a little bit more about that, and we'll give you a chance to do that. But I was also wondering about your history with X-Men and with Excalibur in particular. I think you already had the issue at your disposal. So have you read Excalibur previously, or is this your first time?
No, I've read bits and pieces. I've probably read the first. In fact, I've read to the end of Cross Time Caper. I've got the Epic collections. I've been going through it that way. But yeah, my exposure to the X-Men really starts with the 1992 cartoon. To be honest,
we come back to that a lot on the show.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I've dabbled with the comics, that side of the Marvel universe. But Excalibur, I didn't come to Excalibur through the X-Men. I came through it sort of almost like through a back door, really. When I got back into, I sort of dabbled throughout the 90s and then sort of got into comics quite heavily in the early 2000s. And I was looking for obscure characters. I was like, I want my niche. Who can I have that's mine?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. I landed on Moon Knight, as it goes.
Oh, nice.
But I also found there was a lot of I found out about Marvel UK, and obviously they created all that sort of their corner. And actually, I came across Union Jack first, and then Union Jack led me to the Paul Cornell Captain Britain MI13 run a bit later on, and then I basically sort of backtracked Captain Britain. I was like, oh, so who's this? Who are these British superheroes? And I want to know more about that. Tracking it back. Taking it back all the way really to the original Captain Britain, and found a few issues on eBay, and then jumped really to the Alan Moore years, and then and I was like, oh, this is brilliant, this is amazing, this is weird and it's twisted and it's it's fantastic. And then that led me into Excalibur and the different versions of that. So really it was through, as I often do, this thing like with 20th Century Geek, I often start in one place and then I work backwards and I end up starting on something completely different. So yeah, it was more through like the national heroes and Marvel UK really I accessed Excalibur first time round.
This is a big question and I don't want to get too off track too soon, but what do you make of sort of the transition of the Brian Braddock Captain Britain character from sort of that Alan Moore era to Excalibur? Did you find that a big change in the character, or did you find it just sort of a continuation that made sense?
I think that it's one of those things that when you are invested in comics and when you've lived them and you've read them for quite a long time, you sort of get used to these sort of jarring character changes, especially for sort of like more obscure characters where they're less established. I mean, I'm a Moon Knight fan. We've never had a character. He's changed multiple times. So more obscure characters, I think I'm quite sort of okay with it. It is quite jarring. I've been listening back to episodes of your podcast, and you make a very good point in your very first episode of how like more stuff it has Brian in almost like it's a dark buffoon in some parts, and they try obviously not to make him more serious, but becomes a bit more light-hearted. I'm glad they make that change. But again, I think the thing with Brian is, again, Brian Braddock's had multiple changes. Like if you read the Paul Cornell run compared to this, or if you read like the X-Force, the Rick Remender, where they go into the Omniverse and stuff. Like again, it's a slightly different character. So I wasn't. It's obviously jarring, but I think you get used to those kinds of slight turns of character every now and then.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I want to talk about Brian and Megan's story a little bit in this particular issue because it was one of the Brian and Megan stories that I've actually enjoyed from Excalibur so far. But we will come back to that. But let's do our issue summary and then we'll get right into some of this Dredd intertext and some of these finer moments from the comic. So we know many of our lovely listeners are reading along with the pod. Thank you always for your dearly dear support. But without apology, this time we will start our convo with that plot summary. Always apologizing. We commence proceedings in media res in a penthouse in London on Earth 23238, occupied by demon sorceress Illyana Rasputin and her employer, crime boss Kit Pride. Illyana is using a crystal ball thingy to spy on Excalibur, still lost between dimensions on their train. For reasons that aren't made entirely clear, Kit orders Illyana to summon Excalibur, which she starts to do. Then there's a raid on the premises by the Judge Dredd-inspired Justicers. Advocate Doug Ramsey tries to delay the Justicers, but Excalibur do a better job, their train crashing into the penthouse and causing plenty of mayhem. Kit falls out the smashed window, and Brian and Megan try to save her. This proves difficult as the toxic air and water of this world interfere with their powers. Meanwhile, Kurt is accosted by Justicer Cadbury, who seems to be a human version of himself. Predictably tailless human, Kurt sucks. Kurt has little trouble dealing with him until he's severely zapped by the laser gun of Chief Justicer Bull. Justicer Bull and her crew want to take all the members of Excalibur into custody, but Illyana reminds them that they only had a warrant for Kit. They can, however, take Nightcrawler. Visible mutants are automatically illegal on this world. From there, we check back in with Brian, Megan, and Kit, who are having a horrible time, Megan and Kit literally burning inside and out from the toxicity of the world. Brian finds them temporary refuge on the edge of a building, but they're soon attacked by an army of demonic creatures. Thankfully, Megan manages to transform her body into an armored form capable of enduring the toxic atmosphere. She helps Brian fight off the demons, but Kit nevertheless dies in Brian's arms, her dying breath bemoaning Illyana's betrayal. In the Old Bailey, Nightcrawler is tried and convicted, sentenced to prison and genetic modification. He's tossed in a cell with other visible mutants, where he rescues this world's version of Megan, seen in monstrous form she sported years ago in Captain Britain comics, from a violent assault. When the guards begin to transfer the prisoners, Kurt teleports to escape his chains and takes Megan with him in a stolen flying car. Unfortunately, she's killed by the Justicers. She dies on Kurt's shoulder after shifting to the blue form modeled after him. While this has been going on, back in Kit's tower, Alistair tends to Rachel, who's weak and depleted from powering Widget. Illyana tries to use Alistair's desire for Rachel to manipulate him into helping her take over the world. Then it's on to the action-packed conclusion, in which everyone converges on the penthouse. Illyana becomes the Darkchylde, and this dimension's Brian and Betsy show up to help defeat Illyana and explain the history of the Justicers, who were formed after some type of superhero civil war. We end on the possibility of reform, and Excalibur are freed for now to continue their seemingly endless, but actually will be ending quite soon, journey. So I'm skipping right over first impressions today because we have a lot of stuff to talk about, and I want to start with this Judge Dredd context. Well, I won't move completely fast to first impressions. Did we all enjoy this issue? Because I'm going to assume that we all did and that we're very relieved to be at this issue. But if there's anybody that really hated the issue, you can speak now because I am curious.
I do have one point of contention. Like, I love everything about this issue, but I want it to be a 5-issue story arc.
Yes.
Okay.
Material there merits it.
There's a lot of world here for sure.
Yeah,
exactly.
I like this issue. I like a lot of what happens in this issue. I was looking forward, this was one of the ones that I was looking forward to the last several weeks because I'm like, well, let's see what this is like when I get here, because I want to see if I understand this better than I did when I was 15. I do not. I enjoy it. I have many questions, some of which Scott I think will be able to fill in, some of which are just that I think I have exactly Andrew's take that this could have been way better if they didn't try to fit 100 pages of plot into 22 pages of story, because there's a lot here. There's really a lot, and part of it is also me being shortchanged on, again, this is my like Andrew, Illyana was my favorite character at the time, probably still is. I was looking forward to it when I saw it, and she doesn't get enough to do, and then she's going to disappear from continuity for about a decade, 15-20 years after this story. So that hurt. Yeah, I have many thoughts.
Okay, well, we'll get into all of that stuff.
It.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the Illyana thing, and I'm not debating about whether, like, I could have had 50 issues of all of this story for sure, because I love everything that we do get here. But let's start with that Dredd intertext, as I mentioned. So I'm gonna hope that Scott can help us out a little bit here. I know various of us know like a couple of things about Dredd. I've never really read any Dredd comics at all, though, so I'm other than knowing some of the cultural context from reading the work of Scott and his contributors and Judging Dredd, I don't know a heck of a lot. So Scott, making use of your positioning as a Judge Dredd, and I am calling you a Judge Dredd scholar, so you have to get used to it, a Judge Dredd scholar and a lifelong fan, can you tell us a little bit just about like the history and context of Dredd? When was the character of Judge Dredd created, and what are some of the cultural contexts that those comics pull in that we might be dealing with here?
Dredd is oddly a byproduct of the comic failures of the early 70s. There's a comic called Action from the early 70s, and it was an all-boys comic it was in that time they had like the girls' comics and the boys' comics, and it was all very 70s. And Action got pulled up by the government and by the press raked over because there were several stories that were, for want of a better phrase, advocating violence against the police. There's a very famous cover of a bunch of kids like literally wailing on a police officer, and they weren't happy with it. And so this thing got pulled. Action got pulled, and there was not quite the comic books code of like the 1950s, but there was some rules put in place. And one of the things that got put in place was you can't show contemporary police officers being put under threat, or you can't show sort of like, realistic kind of violence and this other stuff. So a guy called Pat Mills, who was very, very big, and still is very big, I suppose, in English comics or British comics, said, do you know what then? We are going to make all of this sci-fi tropes, and if you can't show red blood, we can show green blood, and if we can't show Dirty Harry or Dixon of Dock Green beating people up, then we will send them into the future. And it was basically sort of like to prove a point. And so they did, and they created 2000 AD, and in that, like, 2000 AD is an anthology science fiction fantasy comic, first released in 1977, and it's populated by all these things. So you have it started with a lineup, Harlem Heroes, which is a future basketball team, which is closer to like rollerball, a comic called Flesh, in which future farmers go back to the prehistoric time to harvest dinosaurs, a character like Rogue Trooper, who was a soldier on a sort of polluted planet, a lone soldier fighting this war, and then Judge Dredd, who is a law enforcement officer of a future world, a future city called Mega City 1, which is a vast city of, at that point, 800 million citizens. And following an event, and this again, like in 77, they hadn't really filled out the whole backstory, but following a large event, large portions of America had become unpopulated or unlivable. And so populations are now living in these mega cities. And these mega cities are judged and sort of ruled by the justice system. And the justice system has a chief judge who sits at the top, and then judges that dispense the law below them. And these judges are judge, jury, and executioner when needed. And so Dredd sort of was introduced as just this really sort of like dark satire of police. That was what it was supposed to be. This, as I said, it was like, if we can't show Dixon of Dock Green beating people up, we are going to have this character, and he's going to have a really elaborate costume. And in the first issue of Dredd, or Judge Dredd, he arrests a guy, and his punishment is to be put in this open air prison, and there's no guards, there's no rails, but it's surrounded by a roadway, and all the cars are going 200 miles an hour, so they're never getting off. And then he's left there. So he was basically left on like an island, like a roundabout, and then it sort of grew from there. So that was sort of the thing, but it grew. It was predominantly written by a guy called John Wagner. The character was created as a design by a guy called Carlos Esquerra. And Wagner is Scottish American, and he's got this really sort of dark satirical sensibility, and both he and Pat Mills are very sort of left-leaning, and from 77 onwards it just becomes a satire of British and American politics and culture, and like, some of it less subtle than others. But yeah, that's the sort of the context of Dredd, really.
I mean, I think one of the things that, well, I'll let you speak to this actually, because I know it's something that you bring up in the introduction to Judging Dredd, that the character and the comics just haven't really caught on with North American audiences the same way that they caught on with British audiences. And obviously the comic is produced there, so I mean, there's distribution issues. But I mean, why do you think that is, though? Like, I mean, it's set in North America, it's a satire of North America. Why does this have so much more appeal for British readers than it does for American ones?
I think it's interesting because we have got quite a few American contributors, and so I think it does appeal to an American audience. I think it's the same American audience that is very much supporting of very indie comics, sort of, especially in the 80s and 90s. One of the things is, I had conversations with people about this. I know I've introduced people to Dredd and they haven't really got it, or they haven't liked it, or whatever. And from the American over the other side of the pond, one of the things I find most interesting is Dredd is a figure of authority. Like he literally is the law. I am the law.
Yeah.
And superheroes, for the most part, aren't. They are sort of like vigilantes, or the outlaw, the hero outlaw. They are sort of going to support truth, justice, in the American way, but they are outside of the law, and Dredd is the law. So he's this sort of figure of he's almost like the anti-superhero. There was a crossover between Dredd and Batman in the early 90s, Judgment on Gotham, and in that, like, Dredd's whole point is like, no, you're a vigilante. I don't care if you are pursuing at that point Judge Death. I don't give it. Doesn't matter to me. The point is, you're a criminal because you're a vigilante, and that's the line. And so I think people struggle with that because Dredd is, for one, and he's a fascist for a start. He lives in a fascistic world, and so there are times that there's been stories where you're like, yeah, you go, you stop them, and then they'll end the story with him well, for example, so there's a really good story where like he saves a number of people, and you're like, oh, it's amazing, and then it ends with him beating someone for them littering, and you're sort of like, oh yeah, he is still that person. And so I think, you know, he's a very complex character to enjoy because, you know, the book is going to continually challenge you. I mean, you know, it's not like with even some of the darker superheroes, you know, they'll challenge you, but up to a point. They're always redeemable.
Mm-hmm.
But with Dredd, you know, you're always that little bit unsure if you should. It's like Rorschach as well. You're like, oh, you know, and he's cool design, it's cool character. Shouldn't really like him. I mean, there's a book, there's a story called America, released 1991, and the whole story is about a young girl called America. She's named by her parents for the country that they emigrate to. Through circumstances, her parents lose their jobs, and because they lose their jobs, they then lose their house, and they have to go to commit a certain series of crimes to sort of survive. They get judged, they get executed, and she then becomes this sort of advocate for anarchy and bringing down the judge system. And so it follows her as this sort of, she's never quite, well, she becomes a sort of terrorist at the end, and terrorist is probably a strong word, but throughout it, Judge Dredd acts as this sort of like shadow, this demon in the background constantly. And I'm going to spoil it, but I still recommend reading it because it's one of the best Dredd stories. It ends with her sort of being lulled into a trap. And in this trap, she sort of thinks it's a protest, and she thinks she's going to bomb the Statue of Judgment, which is a big judge, which literally stands over the Statue of Liberty. Like, literally stands over the Statue of Liberty. And when the judges open fire and execute her. And that's literally, you are watching this as a participant, you know, and it's really brutal. And then the next episode is like, and now back to the sort of the humour of some other person that's doing something wacky in Mega City 1. And you're like, oh, yeah, I'm not... How do I, you know, you talked about the jarringness of Brian Braddock going from Alan Moore to Chris Claremont. Yeah, week to week, Dredd can do the same thing, and it's sort of it's fascinating to see that. And I think sometimes people struggle with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's this plausible deniability in sort of American superhero comics where the characters support the law and the status quo, but are ostensibly outside of it, so they don't have to be associated with the state in that way, and that's very useful to like America's self-image, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally can see what you're saying though, like about the Judge Dredd comics implicate you in the violence, and that can be very uncomfortable for people who are used to comics kind of rewarding their sense of outsiderness, which superhero comics and perhaps particularly X-Men comics tend to do.
Well, one of exactly this implication of like, you know, you are part of the violence. One of the first stories that really struck me when I started to read Dredd in the late 80s, there's a story called The Apocalypse War, and it's a Cold War allegory. Like Megacity in North America is invaded by the Soviet versions of the Soviet bloc, and so it's this big sort of the Cold War becomes an actual war, and they're firing nuclear weapons at each other. So more parts of Mega City are destroyed. Again, the story ends with Dredd invading the Sov city, gets in there, and it's like an espionage thing. Like they sneak in, they've done all these sort of bits. It's really cool. And if it was a Hollywood story, it would reach with, you know, the conclusion of being like he kills their version of the chief judge, and that would be it. But that's not enough. Like he does that, and then he goes back, and they find out that they're threatening to launch the last of the nuclear missiles on North America. And so Judge Dredd passes judgment on the entire Soviet bloc. And what he does is reverse the missiles and fires them back, killing, I think, something like 50 million people. And so, like, there's one of the judges, the Soviet judges, says to him, like, he pleads for these people, and it just has a panel of Dredd response is just denied, and then he presses the button, and you're reading it as a kid, like, you know, you're reading this, and you're like, yeah, like if this was a Hollywood movie, like there'd be that moment of like with Rocky IV where they're like, you know, if you can change and I can change, we can all change. It'd be all everyone would start hugging and stuff. Yeah, that's not Dredd. Dredd's like, no, you are a threat to us, and the only way to do that is to eliminate you, and that's sort of it. So it can be brutal. That I think so that's one of the things I find people struggle with the most.
I'm sort of almost worried now to ask you about the intertext of Dredd in this comic, because I'm not sure that it preserves that complexity. But I'll give you a first sort of chance to answer, you know, what you think this comic is doing with that Judge Dredd intertext, and if you think it's doing something interesting with it or not. I think other of us will have more sort of things to say about how we feel like themes of justice run through this comic, but guest privilege, Judge Dredd, scholar and fan privilege. What did you feel about the use of kind of this Judge Dredd intertext in this comic? What was it doing here?
Well, first, I thought it was a fun issue. I really enjoyed it. You know, you say about sort of the sense of it, I thought it was great. And it has some, it pokes fun at Dredd, and I kind of like some of the fun that it's poking. Early on, it sort of has that introduction, and you get sort of like a view down on this, this city with this complex weaving of roads in amongst you, and that is a mega city view. That's definitely a mega city. And it says, like, ever wonder what would happen if urban development got totally out of hand? And it's sort of like, these crazy sci-fi cities, like, they're ridiculous. Like, we know this is silly, but it's Dredd light for the most part. Like, the justices are relatively brutal, but they're not lethal, which I found was interesting. The aesthetics there, they've got the big shoulder pads, they're going for a similar look. There's a panel even quite a few pages in where you have the lead sort of female justicer, Bull, and she says, you think you can stop me, little girl, on a technicality, but that side profile of the helmet covering the majority of the face, and you have the sort of the lower nose and the chin with that sort of jaw set, is hugely reminiscent of like Brian Bolland or Steve Dillon, early Steve Dillon sort of Judge Dredd art. So that leaped out at me.
Yeah, for sure. I can see that reference there. I mean, I did want to ask you about, because I honestly don't know, like, are there female judges in the Judge Dredd universe? Okay.
Judge Anderson.
Yes, Judge Anderson, Judge Hershey. So there's one of the weird things, although it's a dystopia, and it is a dystopia. And again, I sometimes wonder about this if it was just never on their mind because they were looking at a different satire. Like, there's no sexism and there's no racism in Megacity 1. It's never brought up. Female judges are just as empowered as male judges and just as brutal. And so to have her as a lead judge is quite cool. But again, like, this could just be a Judge Hershey story or a Judge Anderson story or one of those. The other thing that was interesting, I wanted to clarify the character of Doug Ramsey that's in the sort of the introduction when you see the overview of the city. He actually says he's an advocate. I vehemently protest. I'm an advocate of Kitty Pryde, and I assumed he was supposed to be like her lawyer. Yeah, that there's no. I was like, that's.
Oh yeah, that wouldn't even. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, wow, they've actually got more rights than in Mega City 1, so that's quite cool.
Yeah.
So one of the things that was interesting is that you say you get the Chief Justicer, or what's he called? It's obviously Brian, who comes in later. This idea of this is the event of a post superhero civil war, and this is sort of like the enforcement that happened. It is very that feels. I mean, that actually is more of a head of Dredd in many ways, because that's sort of it's said and it's told, but you don't actually get the story till, well, I think it was like 2013 they did the actual story, telling the story of why the judges and the justice system was enforced. And there was a sort of a civil war where a prime minister, better known for other things, in fact one of them is TV appearances, his sort of policies and stuff don't go well, and so he steals an election, and when he's tried to be taken out of office, he fires the nuclear weapons on his own country. And so some of those stories feel incredibly uncomfortable when you read them now. But there's this civil war, and so in order to just struggle to get a form of sort of control and normalcy, and in the chaos they enact this justice system, and it just never goes away. And this has this sort of similar feel, but again, when you see sort of Brighton coming in at the end, it feels like this world could be redemptive, which is again is Marvel. The Marvel always has that sense of hope, I feel. Sort of, they've always got that slight redemption, that possibility of it. However, I was curious that this world's version of Brian, less of the costume, but he's got the haircut and everything. It felt, again, there's a Nazi version of Brian, isn't there? Kicking around.
Yeah. And he's got a very similar look to
that's
this.
it.
Very similar costume.
Yeah, and that sort of stood out to me. So I was like, it's almost like I was going through the world, like one world over from that, and that's a similar sensibility. So it's definitely got a Dredd vibe. I mean, there's a great speech as well where she is, I'm not sure who it is, who challenges, I'm not even Brian, but challenges Bull on what it is a superhero is, and she gives this description, and they're like, you've literally just described yourself. And again, this is this poking fun at the Dredd world, where like if a judge was to describe a criminal, they're violent and brutal and sort of like continually sort of like causing chaos, and you're like, that's you.
Yeah.
You are the same, two sides of the same coin. So they've got that sensibility, and so I enjoyed a lot of this. Where I was like, oh yeah, that's really cool. But I'll be more into just from your point of view, actually. Some of you guys sort of like, when if you're less exposed to the Judge Dredd and stuff, like, was there anything in particular you picked on, or were there things where you're like, what does that mean? Or is this actually poking fun at anything?
I think the main thing he's doing is leveraging sort of the reputation of Judge Dredd and the sort of mythology there in order to shortcut his world building. He's asking the question, what would a world with evil Illyana and Kitty look like? And the answer is Judge Dredd. And that's one of the reasons why this thing can work in one issue, right? Because he's counting on his audience's familiarity with that intertext.
Does it work in one issue for you? Because that was...
It does, but I want it so much bigger.
Right.
You know what I mean?
So
yes, but no.
Yeah, every time I've said this on the show before, every time I read one of these, I try to read it with two mindsets in my head. What do I look at this as, PhD Mav in 2021? And what do I read of this as 15-year-old Mav? I guess I was 16 by the time this came out in 1990. Where was I at then? Where am I at now? And how do I see it? And it works for me because I enjoy these characters. It works for me because I enjoy the exploration he's doing. But I wonder, and this was one where I was having trouble going back to my 1990 self. I said at the beginning, this issue confused me before because so much goes on. I don't think I'd ever read a Judge Dredd comic yet in 1990. I was familiar with it. I was actually, oddly enough, more familiar with Martial Law, which is kind of a parody of Judge Dredd. And by parody, I mean Epic Comics tried to do exactly the same thing, and they just basically made their own version of the character.
Just to intercede there, but Martial Law, written and created by Pat Mills, who actually was one of the founding fathers of Judge Dredd. So yeah, he's...
But it calls itself a parody. It's just trying to redo it, I would say. Is that fair?
Yes.
So I'd read a little bit of that. I don't know if I'd read any Judge Dredd yet, but I certainly wasn't super familiar with either of them. So things happen in this where I felt like I know they're pointing at something, but I'm not sure I know what. And now, 30 years later, I don't know if I can turn off the part of my brain that knows all the tropes and knows all the things. And so I don't know if this plays for people who don't have just a bunch of comic book knowledge already in their head. And so, Anna, you knew the least about it, so you're probably the best litmus test of any of us whether or not it worked.
Well, I didn't read it as a kid, though. I was probably 27. Yeah. So, to me, I was just like, I knew of the existence of Judge Dredd.
But now even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a comic book scholar. I know the
right.
super basics of Judge Dredd, but I don't think I needed that direct intertext necessarily to understand this. It's like a judicial world in which, tiny, that's in all kinds of types of science fiction and movies and stuff. So, I feel like I didn't really need that necessarily.
I can tell you the one that really bothered me then, and I'm more accepting of it now because to me, as I said, and Andrew, I'm sure you'll talk about this more, Illyana was always one of my favorite characters. I loved the Illyana Kitty interplay. I loved any time, since Illyana was mostly starring in New Mutants at this point, she was dead by now, but she had been mostly starring in New Mutants, and Kitty had always been an X-Men. I loved any time they got to get together and, sort of play together, right? So that was exciting to me when it starts. Mm-hmm. The story does this thing where you introduce this concept that Kitty is this evil crime boss. Illyana's working with her, and then right away it pulls that out from under you, and you've got this thing where Brian's trying to save Kitty, but he doesn't know it's not the same Kitty, and then she's just dead, and that story just didn't matter. I felt like this is when you said, I wish this was 5 issues. Yeah, if this had been 5 issues and I could have dealt with issues of this rather than 2 issues spoofing Dirty Pair, I felt cheated in a way.
Well, that's true. But
right, but see, that's the thing, because I think this is largely trying to do the same thing that the Dirty Pair issues tried to do, which is it parodied Dirty Pair by just doing Dirty Pair, and I think this is just trying to do Judge Dredd, but this was more effective, and I wanted more of it because I felt like it wasn't effective enough because it was too quick. Things happen very quickly here.
But I think a lot of the things for me that are really effective about this issue, this is just a great issue of Excalibur to me, in the sense that if I paid however much this was, $1.50 or whatever for this comic, this would be my money's worth. This is just so much. Everybody on the team gets something great to do. Everybody gets a little story. Yeah. There's so much comic, and there's a million little stories, and I can see, wanting it to be 5 issues because there's a million little stories that could have gone a million different ways. But I just this is a crowd pleasing issue. There's we haven't even talked about the Kurt story yet, and I'm just like, I love it so much. Like, it's the thing, obviously, that I remember the most from this issue.
And it's like 4 pages. It's like literally 3 or 4 pages of content, but it's
But there's
there's a
so
lot
much
happens.
there.
Yeah.
There's so much. And so, like, to me, that's my argument in its favor, that this is like a crowd-pleasing issue to the extent that it packs a lot in. And I think it's a lot better than something like the Dirty Pair, you know, homage or whatever we
Way
ended up
better.
calling that, in the sense that a lot of the stuff that we have here, like the ways that we're using this world, are used to build character. And we can get into some of the ways that that happens. Like, I think it's character building for Brian. I think it's character building for Megan. I think it's character building for Nightcrawler. I think a lot of people get really valuable character building here. So in that sense, I think it's a little bit more than an homage. Well, Katie doesn't because she's not in it, but yeah.
No, I think she
like...
does. I think she
Oh,
does.
you
and
think
she's
she
not in the
does,
book.
even though she's not in it? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's a great issue.
Just to see, one of the things you guys are saying is like, you know, this, it goes to the whole cross-time caper, you know, it's that thing of like, you know, quantum leap or sliders or anything when you sort of go into the different worlds. One of the things, and this issue does it, like you say, this was 5 issues. It's sort of you are entering at one point and then it exits on this sort of like, there's a whole discussion about why they reached this point of having this judicial system introduced, and their sort of their Brian Braddock sort of comes in and they're introduced to the fact that, like, you know, this is the page before, like, their human version of Kurt and stuff sort of acknowledges that they're flying in. And he's like, wait a minute, they're flying. And so there's this whole acknowledgement of this world's about to change. Judge Bull even says at the end of it, she says, you know, the law is absolute but not immutable. Perhaps it's time for a change. And then they leave. And all I'm thinking is, hang on.
Never to be seen again.
Yeah, I'm like, wait a minute. This world's about to go through some sort of seismic shift. I want to see what that is. Like, where's that story?
And for the course for cross time. This is
it is, and
the
that's
5th time they've done that in this crossover.
And it sort of feels like, almost like I say, constant missed opportunities. But you're like, hang on, like, you know, if this was now, if this had been done like now, if this was, you know, present day now, Marvel now, this probably would be a 5-issue series. And like, now we're going to have the Justice of Spin-off, and you're going to get 5 issues of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would pick that up.
Series.
Yeah, I would pick that up and I would read it, because I the concept of this, but also like some of the way it's done, I think is fantastic. And so yeah, like you say, it works as an Excalibur issue. And it's fun enough doing this and reading this. I was like, oh yeah, I really want to go back to the beginning and and go through them. So I am going to be listening along, and I'm going to go back and start this. But like, I also want to explore this, and so it's both really exciting and frustrating at the same time. But that's, again, it shows how good it is that I'm invested in both parts, both sort of the ongoing and this new element that's just thrown in. I think it's a really sort of it's just a really well done and a great achievement for a comic from 1990, which I didn't expect much from.
Can I just add my really brief fanfic pitch for if this was like a limited series about the Justicers, which is that they bring up that comment about Kurt's going to be genetically modified to conform to, you know, human specifications. So my fanfic pitch is that Cadbury did look like Kurt and was genetically modified to be human, and that would be his backstory.
See, I would want the exact opposite of that.
I think that ruins the contrast between Cadbury and Kurt, but like, that's the story I would want to read the most if this was its own series.
Oh, see, yeah. Well, see, I would want to read that now that Cadbury knows that there's a mutant version of him out there. What does that do to his psyche of like having been, and this is me. Mutant in the Judge Dredd world means something a little different than what mutant means in the Marvel world. Yeah. Which I love that this issue sort of puts a pastiche on them. But just picking up on what Scott said about this would have been, and what Anna said about this being, your fanfic version. If this were 2021, it would be something that continues. And I was just thinking back, just as you were talking about it, I'm thinking about like Age of Apocalypse. Age of Apocalypse was 1995. It's now 2021, and we're still seeing limited series comic events set in that universe. We just keep going back to it. Everyone's like, oh, let's visit and see what this, this bit of the story would be. It is odd that, there's so much in the cross time caper that was generated that way, and mostly it's not picked up on. Sort of the modern version of Excalibur in post Hickman does pick up on some threads, but not the same way. It's not like we're just going to revisit these worlds, because you guys are right. I absolutely want to know, they've wrecked the entire status quo of this planet. Now. And I want to know what happens next. I really do.
The unfortunate thing is, you say they haven't revisited this. When they did Secret Wars recently, Hickman did that quite recent, last couple of years. When they did Battle Worlds and they did all those different things, and then there's like 2-issue spin-offs and stuff. They had one.
Really?
But not in this world.
Oh,
But
okay.
it was where Christ, I'm really sorry, I can't remember the name, but like it had Captain America and he hands at what's the Muslim girl who's got the sort of Excalibur.
It's Phasa.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
She becomes Captain Britain, but they are set in a world in a Judge Dredd pastiche, but it's a Punisher Judge Dredd pastiche. And I remember reading that, and I was like, even then, you're like, oh, this is really cool. And now I'm actually reading this and going, hang on. they had a world set up to do this. Why didn't they do it? And it's obviously that no one's gone back and seen this issue. So
yeah, I think a lot of it was just forgotten. A lot of the cross time. I mean, a lot of the early, and this is one of the reasons we did this show, right? Is because we have this fondness for it, and I think there's certainly a niche fan base, our fans, thank you, that love this sort of thing. But you know, the Marvel universe is big, and this was always, and we talked about this on like the Inferno issue, right? Excalibur has always been sort of the, and also this is happening of the X-Men universe.
Well, let's get into, speaking of interconnections, and wow, that's not a good transition. But anyway, let's talk about the doppelgangers a little bit more, because I want to give Andrew a chance to talk about Illyana a little bit here, and both of you to talk about what you make of these doppelgangers of Kitty and Illyana, because this is an intriguing scenario at the very least. Kitty as the crime boss and Illyana as her duplicitous servant. There's a lot of directions that we could go with this. So what was your take on it, Andrew? I mean, we've talked on the podcast before, doppelgangers often help us understand our heroes in new ways, recontextualize things through the comparison. So what did you make of this? I'll let you sound off on it.
I think, and I'll try to be brief here because I could go on for a while. But I think it's again a wonderful intertext. This is Claremont sort of showing us what Illyana would have become had she not made her sacrifice, right? It's a great bit of like wing manning for Louise Simonson, which I do think is really beautiful because Claremont cultivated that character. Simonson gave her a stunning ending. And a couple years later here, we've got Claremont adding weight and gravity to Simonson's story by showcasing what Illyana could have become and what the world might have become around her. So it's hard to be like, here's magic, but she's evil, because that makes me sad because I'm a magic fan. But it lends a poignancy to an existing Illyana story that I'm deeply attached to.
What did you make of the relationship between Kit and Illyana in this world, though? I mean, what's going on here with them sort of introducing them in this way? I mean, I'm curious about that relationship, the fact that Kitty is her boss, and, you know, there's a queer subtext with these characters and stuff. Like, do we want to comment on that at all?
It's definitely there, and we've seen it in Excalibur before. It's been at least referenced with the connection between the Soul Sword and Kitty, and we'll see it taken up again in the future. But I think the main thing is I like that Illyana betrays Kit, because again, showing that the darkness we're talking about, it is stronger than the power of the Super Friends trio that we get in this tower, in this version of it. So I don't know. I think that just adds to the weight of the previous Illyana story that Claremont and Simonson had crafted.
Mav, you're desperate to contribute. Go ahead.
I think it's important to understand the context of that previous version of Illyana and that previous version of Kitty, and to a lesser extent, Doug. To me, Doug, I'd say there's less queer coding in this particular issue. For me, this is when everything has gone wrong, right? Illyana, what made her so fascinating to me as a 15-year-old, struggling with my own individuality always and feeling like an outsider always, right? Illyana, even more so than any other X-Man, is that she fits in nowhere. Even with her best friends know that she's secretly evil, right? Like that's always an issue for her. But the lesbian subtext of Illyana and Kitty was there. I almost said from day one, not from day one, because day one she was 7, but from the time she comes back and Kitty and her become best friends on an equal peer level, it's always there. And so if anything, I'd say there's less of it here, because things have gone so horribly wrong in this weird universe, to where like I'm comparing the, oh my God, this is what happens when you don't have friends. Like this is you know, she like that's how I read it, and reading again now, it's like I read this and it's heartbreaking for me, because like you just said, I want magic to be okay. I always just want her to be okay. And I know that as a reader, the story of Inferno, of everything that happens in Inferno, losing her is the most heartbreaking part of Inferno to me. And yet it's why I remember that story so fondly to this day, because Inferno works for me, because I lost my favorite character. Like that's what makes it meaningful. So seeing that happen here matters. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted more of it, because yes, I see that, you know, we're looking at a world where Illyana is secretly betraying Kit, instead of Kitty. But they're barely together in this. And that their relationship only lasts 2 pages, and then she gets knocked out of a window and they never see each other again. So I missed that interplay, which is why I would have liked to see it for longer.
Yeah, but there's an intensity there in terms of
Yeah,
Kitty's
very
reaction to
much
the
so.
betrayal. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it just seems like there's a deep emotionality
Yeah.
to the relationship because of that intensity to me.
And I would
Yeah.
love to see what caused it,
Yeah.
but I mean, I feel cheated by it, but I understand, I think it's a world where the cross time caper has been going on for a long time now, and and it ends next issue. So it's just like, all right, we're done with this. We're just done. And it's a shame because of everything that happened. This and probably, the Billy the Kid issues, which remember are like that's like 2 issues at the beginning. Those are my favorite 2 stories, and I wish this had that much space to breathe as the Billy the Kid issues.
Well, what was your argument about Kitty having character development despite not being here? Like the fact that she's a crime boss?
No, the fact that obviously she doesn't change because we don't see her, but this is through subtle appearances we get to see so much of how the rest of the world reacts to Kitty. The fact that Brian is willing to lay down his life because like he knows where he is. He doesn't know if this is he's run into other doppelgangers before, but oh my god, it's Kitty, she's falling, guess I'm jumping out this window now, guess I'm dealing with acid, guess I'm like so much of it of this is her relationship with Excalibur, even though it's not their real Kitty, right? And then comparing that to, we're not seeing the real Kitty, but seeing how Kit reacts to this version of Illyana, seeing how Kit reacts to this version of Doug. So much of this is like, yeah, I know it's not our Kitty, but in the same way as like we've talked about with Jamie Braddock in his multiple versions last couple issues, it's seeing how an alternate version of Kitty reacts to her compatriots and peers, I think matters for our understanding in context of what real Kitty is, particularly since we're going to have, real Kitty is going to be separate for the team for a good bit coming up.
Like the scene where she dies in Brian's arms is really
he
really cares, and that's like
Yeah.
probably one of my favorite Brian moments from the series so far.
I didn't like because I mean before this you don't even know that he's like I like that Kitty Pryde, she reminds me of me when I was a young lad. That's the most he said about her in 22 issues.
He has a great thought bubble too when he first dives out the window. It says, "I'm sorry, Kitty, I've failed you. Hope dying won't hurt as much this time. Hope this is the last." And it's like, that's right. He's depressed and suicidal, and we haven't touched.
This was a great Brian issue, I thought.
That's efficient writing right there.
So it's efficient because you're talking about his trauma, but also the fact that, I think that matters for their relationships. So is Kitty really developing? No, but the fact that Brian is apologizing to Kitty, and they even liked her until that moment.
Yeah.
So that's why I say I think there's a lot of development for Kitty, and she's not even in this.
Well, what did you feel, Scott, about kind of the portrayal of Captain Britain and Megan here? Because you're someone who knows the original Captain Britain comics as well. And I did say that I thought that this was a decent portrayal of their relationship for once. And my argument on behalf of it would be, I like that Megan changes into the form that can survive this world and is basically responsible for saving them. And they actually work together as a superhero team, which we don't always see them doing. But what was your kind of take on Brian here?
Yeah, I always find, I agree with what you're saying, actually. One of the things, it's always good to see, having known where Megan come from, in fact, that sort of thing, going back to listen to what you guys have described as, that childlike, that sort of traumatized individual, to being someone who's strong and able to utilize her powers to save the day. Like, she's the reason. Like, Brian's overwhelmed, and she's the one that saves him. So I'm like, yeah, that's cool. Like, that's badass. Like, she should be doing that. Like, she's got one of the, strongest powers. She seems to fall out of the Marvel universe much later on, which I think is a real shame. But the thing I find with Brian, within this and Captain Britain, is really that he still is this character who, although, you're saying, Claremont is expressing his trauma and his depression and everything, he still thinks with his fists. He's still that sort of like that gung-ho, jump into action, don't really consider the consequences first. It's sort of like, swing first and then sort of try later on. Like, and to see that that's not working and then that, Megan has to step in, it shows that sort of, because their relationship, and I think one of the things you guys have said earlier when I was listening to the podcast is how sort of inappropriate or how sort of odd their relationship is and sort of inappropriate in some ways. And so to see that there's a balance being gained at this point where, he couldn't have done this alone is actually quite cool. It sort of gives her this agency that I don't think is always evident. Even later on, like I know when she comes back, and sort of I've referenced like the Paul Cornell run, like, you know, she's still this fairy sort of, you know, elfin character who's sort of like, you know, around but doesn't do a great deal. But to give her this sort of agency is actually really cool.
Yeah, I did like the transition of her here, where she's sort of this feminized character who's associated with the natural world, and that's why the space is sort of affecting her so particularly negatively. And then she just turns that on her head by using her like feminized shape-shifting powers to shift into a form that can defend herself and Brian and save the day in this world. And I really liked that shift for her in this comic.
One of the things I was really interested by actually as well, and again, I haven't got enough knowledge of the whole thing, is when they return, you know, so she obviously beats those sort of demon sewer dwelling creatures or whatever, and there's a confrontation with magic sort of against the Justicers. She comes back and she has taken on the form of Kitty.
Yeah.
And she then uses that to confront Illyana, sort of having sort of heard what, you know, Kitty said, because the dying Kitty says it was Illyana, she did the dirty on me. And I was curious about that, because again, it's quite a sort of strong stance, just, you know, because she's obviously chosen to take that form and to take centre stage at this point and confront who we now know is sort of the villain of the piece in this world.
Yeah, I liked that for her too, because she's done this trick before where she's sort of impersonated somebody and thrown somebody off and helped them save the day. But this is much more of an authoritative take on it. You know, I mean, she's sort of being like, I'm going to make up this plan myself and insert myself into the story. And so that is different, I think, than what we've seen from her in the past. So I liked that moment as well.
Yeah, no, that was it, really. I think it's cool to see them. I mean, it's I've always ummed and ahed about them as a pair because of I know where they came from. And you know, there's this thing of like, should he really be? I don't know. Like, is she sort of enthralled to him for what he, you know, for his saving of and all this other stuff? And it always feels a little uncomfortable. So to see her gaining something, and you know, I know down the line that, you know, obviously that they're still together and stuff. So I'm curious now to see how that relationship does grow over the next 100 so issues.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about the current comics because I did suggest in my last review of them that there's at least a technical possibility Kurt is the father of Megan's child. But I don't want to talk about that. We'll just throw that out there, really hoping that's not the case. Anyway, that's a huge like bombshell thing to throw into that, but that's already out there on the internet. That's not news. Anyway, I've been very patient. So can we talk about this Kurt story and the alternate universe Megan thing? I've been so patient. Like, do you guys care about this story, or is it just me? Is it just going to be me sounding off on it?
I'm actually more interested in the Megan of it, but sure, yes.
Yeah, no, I want to talk about that too, but they're inextricably related. So,
yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I have thought so much about this Kurt Cadbury thing, and there's nothing there. Like, it's just kind of a gag. But on the other hand, there's a lot there, because this is the first time that we have a human counterpart of Kurt in a comic. And it's really interesting because there's a lot of questions that are always... I believe so.
I never thought about that, but yeah, it might be. He certainly has lost his powers before, but maybe...
Not prior to this.
Wow, I hadn't really thought about the chronology of it before just now.
So we've talked a little bit in the past about questions of race related to Kurt, so that's interesting to me here. You know, the fact that his doppelganger is white is interesting to me. It's not that interesting in the sense that doppelgangers can be any race or gender, and so it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it's still interesting to me the way that's the person that he's juxtaposed and the ways that he's juxtaposed. Like that little scene with the 4 panels where, you know, he first confronts him and he like realizes that it's him, and he has the line about that he has a tail too. That's just, I'm like just swooning all over myself over those 4 panels. Those 4 panels are like a fan servicey thing of showing why Kurt is not the traditional jerkwad male action hero and why he's better and why he's more desirable. And it's just 4 panels, but it really does that effectively, both between the visual contrast between them and his attitude toward the fight. The jerkwad guy is just trying to like kick and punch him, and Kurt's like just avoiding him like effortlessly. And of course, using his tail, perhaps one of the most graphic symbols of his difference, is just so wonderful. And yeah, I just loved every part of that so much. And it's such a little thing, but I mean, it's just a little thing that's just part of the reason why I love this character so much.
Yeah, I think the lesson that Kurt is learning in this scene is that like the value of his nonconformity.
Mm-hmm.
That if he did get this heartmost wish, he might have become a tool, and thus gaining this sort of perspective on the value of his outsider status, which I think is really important for Kurt as a character.
Question for Anna: do you think by now Kurt still wishes to be normal? Because
no,
in 2021,
I don't think he did in his first appearance.
You don't think?
No.
Okay, because I don't know. I always read I always read earlier Kurt as though he was sort of jealous, and by now I don't think he is at all.
No, I don't think he ever was.
You don't think he ever was? And okay, so
that's just me. I don't know
always see a
if
transition.
Scott or Anna think differently.
There's different readings of him on that level, and I know different fans have different investments in him too. Like, I'm always emphasizing him as a shameless character. Some fans do see that shame in him more, and I think that both readings are kind of valid. But definitely my reading of him is more that the ways that he's unique, at least was unique when he was introduced into this universe, is the idea that he had his powers from birth, and we didn't get his full backstory, or not his powers, but his physical mutations at least, right? Yeah. So, and that gives him a very different relationship to his body. Like, that is normal for him. So why would he have a desire to return to human? Like, that's Beast's story, but that's not Kurt's story, because he doesn't have like a human counterpart. To me, it's like the idea of, and I've mentioned this before, but like the story from the late 90s where the high evolutionary demutates everybody, and it's a dumb story, but it's really, really accurate in terms of, to me, Kurt's character. He gets turned into a human and he just hates it. He has like body dysmorphia, like he can't handle it at all. He's like, I can't even walk in a straight line without my tails. My hands have too many fingers. I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. And I'm like, of course that's how you would react. Like, his body, that would be the same way that one of us would react to being changed into Kurt, right? Like, I mean, that is his body. There is no human reference point. Like, I mean, he would be horrified. Yeah,
it's not his normal, rather.
Exactly.
But now he does have that reference point in the form of Cadbury, this tool of a fascist government.
Yeah, for sure, right?
There's two things I want to throw in, actually, because I think, you say about Kurt and his desire to be normal. I think I've never read, whenever I've read the comic book version, let's say the 616 version, I've never read that as wanting to be normal, is probably the wrong word, but to be human, to sort of to lose his identity and his mutant powers. But I know that they've used him as in that position if they haven't had access to Beast in other media. Like, I know it comes up in the X-Men cartoon, X-Men Evolution, and a few other sort of like side comics and stuff. So I think he acts as a sort of a cipher, for that when they want to in other media. But I've never read this version of Kurt in that way. I'm going to flip this little scene in its head, because one of the things that there's some elements of this I found interesting, coming from a Dredd point of view, really, I suppose, is Kurt's met other versions of himself. Like, he's been through this multiverse, and he sort of goes, he's accepting this point. Like, oh yeah, there's other versions of it. This version is human, so there's that variance. But Cadbury's world, which is really bizarre saying that as well, because Cadbury obviously is based after Cadbury's chocolate, and there's a place really near close to me called Cadbury's World. So, so Cadbury, his world is shattered because he doesn't know that there's the multiverse. He has, as you said, brainwashed and exists in this sort of fascist, anti-mutant world, and he represents it as a part of the law enforcement. And so to be confronted by a mutant version of himself, it must be pretty shocking. Like, it puts all your values in question, and obviously that's why he sort of stutters and hesitates, and Kurt's able to take advantage of it when they fight. But I thought that was more interesting. Again, it goes back to this other world where, like, this version of Kurt, this Cadbury, he's having to face off against this concept of, like, you say about, well, if Kurt was to be human, he could be this tool. Well, for Cadbury, just as easily, he could be a mutant and therefore be a prisoner. So there's that version as well. And the reason I find it interesting is that Judge Dredd himself, Judge Joseph Dredd, is in fact a clone. He is a clone of the first Chief Judge Fargo, and he had a brother. They went to the academy to get the Rico, and Rico is his obviously exact double. They are clones, and Rico went bad, and it's actually Dredd who took him down because of he sort of basically sort of starts to become a bit of a crime boss within Mega City, and so there's this confrontation of him and his, they call him brothers, but these two clones of each other, and it's this question of, like, well, how come one can be this sort of the figure, the sort of like the supreme figure of sort of this fascist authority, and the other one gives into an element of anarchy and becomes a criminal, but they are the same. He actually judges Rico. He sends him off to they have a prison planet called Titan. He spends sort of years there, and so it sort of echoed that for me, this idea of having to face off against someone who is you, but is almost like, not just your opposite, because that's obviously a thing, but like a corrupted version of you, is not just a, oh, I could have been you. It's like, no, you are literally me and a variant of me. So I sort of took that from a Dredd perspective as well. But I know this is obviously the Excalibur book, but I actually felt kind of sorry for Cadbury in that world, where, like, his world, his world's been kind of shattered. Where he's like, no, and he then it's sort of never picked up. But it was kind of interesting to me that's the duplicate that they sort of they have this confrontation with.
I mean, I think if you're like coming at it from like an Excalibur and Kurt fan, you're just like, man, this loser that reacted this way to Kurt, he's the worst, because I love Kurt so much. So of course. Let's talk about the Megan aspect of this story. So the alternate universe Megan aspect and the little vignette that Kurt gets with her here. Now, there's things I love and things I don't love about this little vignette, and I'm sure we're going to talk about both. I will say just off the top, the thing that I do love is that it's her monstrous form that he's interacting with primarily, and that creates a suggested affinity for them that we haven't had teased out properly in the comics, I would argue, up to this point. I mean, we've talked about nice guy tropes in relation to Kurt, and that is something that you can read into him in terms of, does he have an affection for her because she's a pretty blonde lady, or is it more complicated than that? And I think having them together in prison, fellow mutants, fellow monsters, fellow persecuted outsiders, and they have that affinity on that level, I think that's really important to adding something more complex to their relationship. So I did really like that aspect of it a lot, but there's problems in terms of what happens here. I mean, do you want to take a stab at it, Andrew? I'm sure you're going to have feelings about it as the president of the Megan fan club.
I don't know. I'm kind of going a few different directions on this. I think, yeah, the problematic elements are clearly there. I really don't like the idea that this is Megan had she not blossomed as our version did.
It's not good. It's not good.
Because I don't think she is blossoming.
It's not good.
She's in a really bad relationship in point of fact. But I do like the scene of just, and it's 3 panels, of just her kind of dying, going from monstrous to these flickering lights to this moment of absolute peace on Kurt's shoulder. Like, I know I shouldn't like it, but I feel the pathos in that scene for some reason.
I mean, Kurt's oh yikes face is like, oh God. I feel for him. I mean, okay, so like, let's put a finer point on I'm assuming what we think is problematic here is the lack of agency for the Megan character. The fact that she's being present in this story to serve a very stereotypical chivalric fantasy for Kurt, right? And she's fulfilling his ego by transforming into him as she dies, and then is like, it's okay, you did what you did and it was worth it, even though by kissing me I got shot. I mean, it's not great
to die, but I'm happy.
It's not great. Like, dying was worth it. Yeah, dying was worth it just to be kissed on the cheek by you and die on your shoulder. It's not great. So that's the harsh reading of it. But I do like those final panels in the sense that I do think there's a suggestion of Kurt having to reckon with his actions there. I mean, having to see her transform into the version of himself that he's most invested in and then watch her die on his shoulder. It's not like he's coming out of this unscathed.
But he does, though. That's the problem.
Yeah, well,
she doesn't come up again.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I'm going to assume he's profoundly affected by that, even if we're not going to see that explicitly said in the comics. I mean, he's certainly like really angry when he like busts into the building in the next scene. And I mean, his face here too is like really well done. I mean, Davis is often just so good at communicating so much with a facial expression. And I do think that choice of Kurt's face as she's dying, like he's just, oh God, like it's just, there's a lot going on there.
This is, I think, another one of those ones where it's a drawback of 5 issues worth of story being told in one issue. I like this scene. I like what happens. I think it's problematic because it's rushed. I think that's the problem. We can't spend too much time giving alternate version of Megan number 478 more agency than this. But I do think she allows us to understand 616 Megan a little better, because I presume I don't like the usage of the if she hadn't blossomed. I don't like that. But
Such a gross line. Oh.
Yeah. But I'll just call that bad writing on Claremont's part to allow the rest of it to be good. Good writing. Like I like that it is showing a Megan without the baggage of a Brian or a Kurt. It's a Megan that grew up in hell,
but she's broken.
In the hell of Judge Dredd land, right? But it does show that she has a life beyond this, that she can make choices, and it shows that I assume that 616 Megan is just like this person, which is she just wants to be loved like everybody else. Like the fact that Kurt, who is a demon in and of himself and might have his own, if I want to be cynical about it, Kurt's hoping that she can survive so that I can have my own Megan too. I can take her with me, right? But I think that from this Megan's point of view, someone loved me despite me being a monster. I like that it shows that that's what she wants out of life. I find it a little weird and because that happened, I get to be beautiful for 12 seconds before I die. And also blue, because that's what he wants. So like it kind of,
Yeah, that's not a great
It,
look.
it's kind of it's kind of tropey at the end. I get it, but I like the underlying sentiment that I'm just going to imagine that this was one, that there were 5 issues of this story, and there's one devoted to Kurt's story with this Megan, and that's where it and it's just better told because it's got breathing room. So,
And I mean, there just is something too where it's hard for me to defend this because I'm not saying like it's a good fantasy because romantic fantasies are often problematic. But I mean, the
Mhm.
fantasy as a female fan who's like basically in love with Kurt, I mean, it's like he's gonna like be this fellow monster who's gonna save me and we're gonna go off and be monsters together. It's like that
And
is
then you
kind of what
die.
I know. I don't want to die in the story, but like the other elements of it are exactly what I
Yes.
want out of a Kurt story
Right.
because we go hard on his chivalry, but it's just
Right.
like chivalry can be a very appealing fantasy that's not necessarily evil depending on how it's handled, right? And
Right.
so I just want to make that point because we sometimes just go hard on this is just
Yeah.
Kurt's fantasy, and I'm like, it's my fantasy too, though.
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, what I just said, what's the alternative, right? The alternative is that he saves her and then she goes on.
She comes
and,
along and
like,
joins Excalibur.
And she comes along and joins the team, and we have 2 Megans, and hey, there's one for each of you, which was the problem we had with Dirty Pair, right?
come
Like, there's
on.
no good other way out of it. So I understand.
She stays in this world and gets to be her own person is the better version of it.
Well, I think something
Sure.
interesting. One of the things, if you're going to do that, this book this issue ends with a seismic shift in this world. They actually say, well, the law can change, and even sort of like their version of Captain Britain of Brian sort of says, maybe it's time to do something. Why could she not be brought in if she's going to have her own agency or something? Brought in then as a representative of the humans, of the mutant population, to let her not only survive, but then through her surviving and gone through this is sort of like her understanding and growth is then the ability to represent the mutant population. Give her, she doesn't have to go along. Give her a purpose in this world that
because
allows
she
her
got
to
fridged. Because she got fridged
exactly.
to allow Kurt's emotional
I
growth.
also-
Yes, that's why.
I have real problems with some of this, and the problem being that I have is that so she dies in this like the little Fantastic Four car, and Kurt then uses it to break through.
That's it. Yes. Did
And
he leave her in there? Did he
yeah,
just
where's
batter
her-
her body?
where's her
He
body?
brought her up.
Oh, God, I don't want to think about it.
I was going to bring that up at the end because that's my problem too. And I know Anna's going to say headcanon. He landed, dropped her off, buried her, and then got back in.
Of course,
No,
he
for
did
me, it's
something
like,
very respectful.
yeah, I thought the same thing. Did he battering ram her with her body?
That's because that's how it comes across. That's how I read it. Because the other thing I was curious about is when she is shot by Bull, Justice a Bull, and he never confronts her. Like Kurt is never given the opportunity to confront her. He partly takes on Illyana, but he as the demon thing. But then at the end of it, it's actually Kurt who says like, "Well, give us a chance, and we'll be on our way. You'll never see us again." And I'm like, hang on a minute, like. This is the person, and like, granted, like she, there must be some rules because she's a representative of law enforcement in this world. But you've literally sort of like you've started to bring down this society's justice system, yet you're not willing to confront this one person who you've just seen kill someone that you've saved. Rushed is the point. I think rushed is this thing of this issue. Like if this was a 5-6 issue run, all of this could be addressed. Like you could really expand on some of these characters and have those confrontations and have those discussion points. But yeah, it's almost like right, we've hit that mark. We've done this bit. He's escaped. She's been redeemed, or you've seen you've seen this element. She's been fridged, to be fair. Move on, as you sort of said, move on to the action-packed finale, and then we go on to the next issue. And so, yeah, that it was the sort of the aftermath that I had problems with, rather than the interactions.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. I'm gonna headcanon it a little bit too, just once again, just because, okay, I do think Kurt is someone who is very emotional, but he's also very pragmatic, and he is somebody who's been through, I mean, we don't talk about Kurt's horrible trauma in his life that much. He's got his backstory is a mess. He had to kill his own brother, and then people thought he was a demon and tried to kill him. He's got a terrible backstory. And so, I just think, in terms of his reactions to things, I can completely believe that this could happen, and he is completely traumatized by it, and he just swallows all of that and doesn't bring it up because that is exactly the way he approaches life. He is a person that internalizes everything and doesn't complain and looks on the bright side of things. And so I almost think it actually would be out of character for him to yell at Bull, because one of the reasons why him yelling at Brian in Sword is Drawn is so shocking is that he never does that. And to
and
me,
he did
I
talk
read
down Kitty from doing that in an earlier issue, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's actually very in character for him, and it doesn't make him him a bad person. It's just a result of some of the ways that he's very emotionally closed off because of the ways that he deals with trauma. I mean, not unlike the way that we've talked about Rachel in the past, right? It's just something that I feel like is always implicit with Kurt that doesn't get talked about directly as much. And I actually think it will get talked about a little bit when Davis is on the book and we have a lot of monologue with Kurt. But that's my PR manager defense of that scene, because I did feel like even though it's unsatisfying, it was in character for him.
He also doesn't really have qualms about using people's bodies as weapons in explosions. Let's be honest, we've seen it before. So.
You gotta undercut all my good work, Mav. All right,
that's what I'm here for.
We've gone on for a while, so we will wrap it up there. But final thoughts on this issue, things that you're desperate to bring up that we didn't get a chance to talk about.
Oh, there was one scene near the beginning where Alistair and Widget are losing their cool. I like that as like a kind of connection to the audience about how long the cross time capers.
Oh, yeah, that is.
I thought that was an important touch to kind of show that transition.
I like that. Good one. Was yours already complaining about the car thing, Mav?
Yeah, mine was the car thing. Mine was totally. I was like, I'm leaving this for last. I just want to point out that he used her body as a battering ram, and then Scott pointed it out. So that was my final thought.
I'm gonna give Scott the last word before we do the letter column, because I've got a good one. But my just tiny little thing is I just have to say that Kurt's body language throughout this issue was just so well done. Like from the first page where they're all standing there, and I love just the little thing after they crash the train through the penthouse and he's on the ground kind of injured and exhausted, and that was just like a nice little thing to show some of the consequences of like this violence and sort of this grueling trip that they've been on. And I always love seeing Davis draw Kurt, but I think because we haven't had it in a few issues, I was just so appreciative, and he did some really nice work with him in this issue. Scott, final thoughts.
Nothing really. It's a really good issue. Really enjoyed it. Lots sort of take in, and it's definitely made me want to go back and read more Excalibur, which is always a good thing. The one thing I wanted to raise that sort of hasn't been mentioned is the cover.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it.
As you said, Davis's art is always fantastic, but the cover just feels like it's got this sort of wanted dead or alive, the Kitty Pryde, and it's got the death of Kitty Pryde and all sorts of things. So I love that it's got the tease of what's going on. I mean, it's not really what it is, but it has echoes of sort of Days of Future Past, but also just it feels like it could be. The Dredd pastiche is in there as well. It's just a really cool cover. Like it's a really well done, a really nice cover. So yeah, it's really it's a great issue. Just a good read. I'm glad I got to read it, really, for all the bits and pieces.
We are so glad we got to read it with you. I'm just going to quickly spotlight a letter from the Sword Strokes letters page, more for the editorial response than for the actual letter. So this is a letter from David Thill in Grand Prairie, Alberta. So mostly the letter is kind of complaining about various X-Men titles, and then they say, however, through it all, Excalibur remained a creative light on the horizon. Now finally, Power Pack is showing signs of becoming worthy of its potential. Plug for all you comics purchasers out there. X Factor is in a plot that has been thoroughly enjoyable despite its total irrelevance to everything else that's going on in the universe. Even the X-Men is looking up. Only the New Mutants remains lost, and even they could be unexpectedly saved by a little quick action on somebody's part. Excalibur was there first, however, and for that you have my eternal respect, my admiration, and my undying support. May Excalibur never be sheathed, and until the Punisher accidentally cracks a grin, make mine marvel. And then Terry Kavanagh tells him about some exciting new developments that he hopes are going to make him even happier on the X-Men books. He says, we're glad we helped you maintain faith in the Marvel Universe during your trying period with our other books, David. Hope you'll check out the New Mutants in the near future, because with a hot new direction, hot new characters, and a hot new artist, Rob Liefeld, it should be right up there. You must get... It should be right up there on your must-get list alongside Excalibur. So, David, I don't know how you reacted to the shift to the Rob, but I hope you were as happy as Terry Kavanagh hoped you would be.
Yeah, they also around this time they were just about to cancel Power Pack on poor David here too. They just destroyed his world.
Well, he still had Excalibur.
I was not born to live a man's life, but to be the stuff of future memory. The fellowship was a brief beginning, a fair time that cannot be forgotten. And because it will not be forgotten, that fair time may come again.
So we will end things there. Other than, Scott, we've already plugged some of your work, but let's remind everybody again. If you want people to find you online, where can they find you? And what work of yours should they be checking out?
Yeah, well, let's do the work first. So, yeah, we've said Judging Dredd, examining Judge Dredd in his wide world from Sequart, available on Sequart and Amazon. I also want to shout out all the books from Sequart. Sequart do a whole host of books, sort of doing accessible analysis of comics. And for you guys in particular, there's a book called The Best There Is at What He Does, examining Chris Claremont's X-Men by Jason Powell. And so, yeah, there's a whole host of books on there about creators and comic runs and all kinds of different pieces. So sequart.org. Seriously, go check it out. It's a fantastic website. Loads of articles and stuff on there as well. For me, I'm also contributing 2 more things. I've got an essay coming up on the Saga of the Swamp Thing, and I've just started. I'm in the early doors. I'm in the exciting part of the project. I'm doing a book on Moon Knight, collection of essays about Moon Knight. And I've had some really fascinating contributors coming forward on that one. So that's going to be exciting. If you want to come find me and my podcasts, you can find me on Twitter. It's at 20th Century Geek. And that's 20th Century Geek. And 20th Century Geek is just me sort of basically looking at all things from the 20th century. Everything, comic books, films, everything I fancy. It's basically me going, oh, that's interesting, and doing whatever I want. I also have a fortnightly podcast with Julian Darius, who I met through Sequart. It's the sci-fi movie podcast. We talk and break down and discuss all kinds of sci-fi movies. We recently just talked about The Man Who Fell to Earth the other day. Both really enjoyed that. That's a fascinating conversation. And that's so at Pod Time Space. So you can find us on there as well. And all those podcasts are available on all usual podcast catchers.
Amazing. Yes, we will link all of those things on our Twitter and our show notes. Thank you so much again, Scott, for joining us.
No, thank you for inviting me. This has been fantastic, really good fun, and a great opportunity to plug the book and to talk to some great people about comics. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, in 1 week's time, we will be on to episode 25, in which we will be discussing Excalibur number 24, Tempting Fates, in which the Crosstime Caper barrels to its sort of epic conclusion, and Sadder Courtney helps Kitty celebrate turning 15 again. There's a lot of complicated gender and sexuality stuff to talk about in that issue, and we'll have a very exciting guest to help us carefully navigate it. In the meantime, if you liked what you heard, please follow us, like, and review the podcast wherever you're listening to it or watching it. Don't forget to check out our fabulous YouTube videos, which you can find via our website or the Vox Podcast YouTube channel. As always, if you want to chat with us about Excalibur or pitch yourself as a guest for a future episode, let us know. You can reach out via our website, goshgollywow.com, where we've got some fun extras, and via Twitter at goshgollywow, where we post daily pages from whatever issue we're reading that week, and more fun extras. Thank you, Andrew and Mav, for another rebellious conversation. Thank you, Scott, for helping us pass judgment. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to Maximilian of Thought4 Music for our truly epic theme song. Play us out. Did you like I worked hard on that outro?
Yeah, I like that one.